Evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. If you can let me know as you start to come in that you can hear me okay, that will be great, because last week wasn't so helpful. I'm just gonna pop a note in the chat. Okay, hopefully that chat has gone through. Great, thank you, Renee, for confirming the sound from Texas, and good afternoon. Okay, shall we get started then? So this week we're going to talk about yokes. I've just made a few notes here. If you've got any questions as we go along, drop them in the comments, the chat. I should be able to see whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube. I'm just going to quickly check that the Facebook is live, which I hope it is. There we go. I can see myself on 2 screens. Lucky me. Okay. Loud and clear from North Carolina. Thank you, Terry. Right, so I'm going to run through some of the yoke stuff this week. There's a couple of issues a couple of people have had, so I'm going to address the cardi and the sweater separately, although a lot of what I'm talking about is going to apply to both of them. So I'm going to have a quick overview of the yokes, then we're going to talk about adjustments and a bit of customization. If we get time at the end, we're going to look at splitting the yoke, which is, so splitting the yoke and the body is the next section after your yoke is done. So, quick update. We're going to start with the cardigan. This is my little project bag for the cardi. So I'm just going to pull this out. So, confession time, I've only started this afternoon on the cardi, but I wanted it to be fresh in my mind, and I didn't want to have done too much because I wanted to show my progress. And I've just dropped my yarn, obviously. Okay, so this is the beginning of my cardigan yoke, and I wanted to talk about the cardigan because it's not a straightforward raglan yoke. I mean, it is and it isn't. Typically with a raglan yoke, you kind of say this was a sweater, you'd get the back, the sides and the front. So obviously this is the cardigan, but on the first row you only get the the back and the sides, and as you increase, you add this corner, which is the front corner, and you've got a V-neck drop on the front of the cardigan. So you're going to increase at the front and you're going to get a nice gentle V-neck. In fact, I can show you on the one I'm wearing. So the V-neck is quite gentle. But I know on the first few rows, it can cause a little bit of confusion. Hello, Susan from Arkansas. Thank you for the later time. Oh, I'm glad that it works for you. I think maybe this evening time might be a better one to stick with, because I think we do get to capture more people at this time of day. An evening is fine for me. So yeah, so this is, I think I've done 7 rows. I've got to just before the repeat on the cardigan. I've got my patterns here. Sorry, I've got a lot of bits of paper today because I want to make sure I've got all my notes. Yeah, so I've got to row 8 on the cardi, and this is the double knit. Now, I wanted to talk quickly about my gauge. If you've watched my little vlog from this week, you'll see that I made my little gauge. This was the one that I frogged. And my gauge swatch, I've blocked it now, so it's okay. But when I made this swatch, it looked like this initially. So I started really tight and my tension got looser and looser and looser. You made it home in time. Good evening. Hope you had a nice afternoon at your friends. Sorry, we'll try not to chat too much with the chat, although it makes it more fun. Anyway, so originally this swatch, it kind of went like this. So it started off really tight, and as I sat and relaxed as I was swatching, my tension got looser. So I blocked it, and I blocked it pretty much evenly. And what I decided, so I made this swatch with a 4mm hook, and the stitch gauge was pretty much bang on before blocking. Now I know from experience this yarn grows with blocking. This is a blocked swatch, so I decided in the end to go down to a 3.5mm because I realised my tension naturally relaxes, and I really don't want this to be too big. Interestingly, my row gauge was a bit tight, so I had much fewer rows in this swatch. More rows than I needed. So I've kind of made a mental note just to relax on my row gauge, and I am going to talk about what to do if you're with your yoke, if your row gauge is a bit tight, if you need more rows, or if you need to take some rows out if it's too loose. So yeah, I just wanted to really talk about this swatch, one because I don't always get my tension exactly right, and it's not always consistent, and I think just acknowledging and accepting that your gauge isn't always going to be consistent, it's like acknowledging that there's a problem is half the way to the solution. So let's not pretend we're all going to have perfect gauge, and if you have perfect gauge, well done. Mine isn't. So the other thing I want to show you, this is my blocked swatch, so you can see it's got quite a lot of movement in that, whereas this is my yoke. You can kind of see, you know, it's kind of curled and it's much stiffer. So this is 100% wool that I'm using. This is the West Yorkshire Spinners Colour Lab, and I love this double knit yarn. They do it in double knit, and I think they do it in a full ply as well. It's a really nice, relatively affordable yarn. If it's West Yorkshire Spinners, so it is a UK based dye, but I think they sell globally, but it's what I like to use. So another couple of things I wanted to talk to you about this yoke. One, I've got my little running stitch markers. Now I love this technique when you're working a yoke or anything with a corner that can be a bit tricky to see. In my blog post on tips for top down, I go into detail about how I work this running stitch marker, but basically you've got your increase is 3 stitches in one for this. So each time I make that central stitch, because you don't increase on every single row on this pattern, I just kind of pull this long. It's just a long piece of contrasting yarn from another project I've just finished. But the reason I like to have it running, so I just attached it to the first row and I just kind of thread it through, is because as your yoke gets bigger, you get a really good idea that your line is kind of consistent, because sometimes if your increases maybe went off a bit, this is going to like bend, but it wants to go generally in a consistent line. Now as the yoke changes and gets towards the end, there are changes in the angle in some of the sizes of this seam, but that's because it will kind of curve to go under the arm. So overall you should have a generally consistent line. So I just wanted to show you that. The other thing to show you is the last row I finished on with this yoke, which was row 8. It was a non-increase row, and you can see I've got a little bit of a curl there. I don't know if you can see it better from that, because I've got no increase, so it's almost like tucked under. But the next row I'm going to increase, and that's basically going to straighten out any slight curling that you start to get. So if you're getting that, don't worry, it will kind of even out as the yoke grows. Towards the end of the yokes, again depending on which sizing, you might find that the ratio of non-increase row increases, so you might find you get a bit more of a curve towards the end of the yoke. But as I say, that's when your raglan line is starting to curve under the armpit anyway, so it will sort of flatten out. But the point I'm making, if it's not perfectly straight and flat, that's okay, don't worry about it. Likewise, these aren't right angles at the corners. They're kind of not far off, but they're not exact right angles. So again, don't worry too much that it's not a rectangle. So you can kind of see how that's forming, and this is the front side, so you kind of start here and then you build this front so it looks a bit like a triangle until it evens out. So here it kind of comes down like that. So I just wanted to share some of those bits. Let me just check if there was, oh, the other thing I wanted to talk about the cardigan is less about the yoke, but it's more about the way you use the pattern. I'm just going to pause and have a sip of tea. I'll try not to have a coughing fit this week as well. Hi from Oklahoma. Hello, Sylvia. Okay, so in the cardigan pattern, at the end, I have this whole series of tables. And what this does is this gives you the number of stitches between your marked corners. So I've got these stitch marks in the corner. So this is going to give me the number of stitches. So this is on row A, is going to tell me the number of stitches I've got between marked stitches. The reason I put that in, so they're all calculations I had to do as part of the design anyway, and I decided to put them in because as it grows, it's quite easy to miss a stitch here or there. So I'm just going to give you a few tips for keeping on track there. But I want to say about these numbers, these were never really intended to be followed as, to be worked with as the pattern. I've had a couple of people that this has actually caused more confusion than it's solved. So it says at the top of the first page count, these don't include your marked stitches. And the other thing I want to add to that is this is what the numbers should be at the end of the row. So if you're following these workings, so you say you're on an increase row, I hope this is all making sense. You work your 3 stitches in 1 stitch as an increase, then you work to the next marked stitch and work three stitches in there. If you're using these stitches to count how many stitches to make between those increases, it's going to be wrong because it's not counted those 2 extra. So you've got sort of 3 at the corner like this. It's not counted these 2. This is like, I feel like I'm in Star Trek doing all that. Anyway, yeah, so if these are the marked stitches, you've not counted this one, so that'll probably be off by 1 or 2 stitches depending on which side you're on. So I just wanted to clarify that. So this is really meant as almost like, I call it like a back translation. So it's a cross check. So if you're worried about your stitch count, the first thing to check is how many stitches you have all the way around, and that should be checked against the main pattern. The other thing to check is that the number of stitches on the shoulder sections are equal. So these should always be the same as each other here. These on the front sides should always be the same as each other. So that's a really good way to check you're on the right track. And if those 2 are the same as each other and you have the right number of stitches on the, on the back and overall in the whole row, you should be good. So I just wanted to address that because I think sometimes you put things in to try and make something easier and it inadvertently causes a bit more confusion. So apologies if that's you, but hopefully that's clarified any discrepancies you might see. Okay, so I think the other thing to say about these numbers is the first few rows, like the back one. So for each size and yarn weight, there's a table of the stitches at the back, the stitch at the arms, and the stitches at the front bit. For the first few sort of setup rows, the sides and front stitches may not quite sit right because there's increases at the front, and just for the first few setup rows, I wouldn't like focus on what the overall stitch count is, because some of those stitch counts, although they're accurate, it's kind of in theory. So on the first row, you haven't kind of sort of got some increases for the fronts, but not it's a bit confusing. I'm not going to go into it because I'll start getting into maths and tying myself in knots. But yeah, just tend to focus on the overall pattern because the first sort of 4 or 5 rows, whilst you get into the stitch pattern, focus on the numbers given in the pattern. Okay, Sonia, if you found the chart so useful for hands. So Sonia, I'm just going to read it out because I know not everybody can see the comments on all the platforms. Sonia says, I found the chart so useful for my hand spun. So pleased you did them. It saved me. I always lose count when counting big numbers. that's kind of one of the main reasons I wanted to do it. And actually, with a yoke, a raglan yoke like this, it's much easier to count the sections, and compare the sections, because that's a lot of numbers to count. By the time you get to the end of the yoke, you're kind of in the hundreds often. So I'm glad that happened. You just need that clarity about whether the increases are included or aren't included. And the reason I didn't include them is because then I'd have to make a decision about whether I included on the back or the sides, and then the same for the front. So, I just took them out of the equation. Terry, I was the one that had confusion about the chart and the total number of stitches. I figured it out. Every few rows, I check each section stitch count. Perfect. That's a really good way to do it, Terry. I'm glad you kind of got there in the end. It's like checking every few rows that you're on track is the best way to not have to frog loads back. Because I appreciate you don't always want to count 80, 100, 110 every row, especially when you're kind of getting used to the repeat, but it is worth just cross-checking that these side ones are the same, these front ones are the same, and then every few rows, maybe. So the way I've been doing it is on the non-increase rows. For me, I found that easier just to count the whole row, because you just keep going to the end and then you've got your 2 increases on the ends. So I found that the best way to cross-check. Like I say, I'm only on row 8, but that's probably how I'll go through with it. And sometimes what I will do, I'll count to 50 and I'll pop a marker in. Putting markers in every X rows can be quite a helpful way when you've got huge numbers. Okay, so I think that's pretty much what I wanted to share about the cardigan. If you have any more questions, if you're working on the cardigan pattern, do pop them in the chat. So now I'm going to update you on my sweater version. So I have just got to the last row, just finished the last row of the yoke in this one. So here we are. There's a couple of things I want to talk about with the sweater. I'm just going to do a little show and tell. So somebody asked me about making this, hang on, let's get it in, about making this seam a little bit less visible. So the first thing I'll say is the seam actually sits, this will be the back, but it kind of sits when you split the yoke, which is my next row. Oh look, that's good. It hasn't, my gauge on this, my rows were a little bit short, so actually this is a little bit short. So the next row is my yoke split row, so it's a bit short, but once I've blocked it, that's going to be a decent fit on my underarms once I've added the underarm chain. So I haven't actually tried this on, so it's quite nice to see how it looks. Anyway, so the way I always work turned rounds, and I've had a few people that have struggled with the turn rounds, that are maybe used to working either continuous rounds or always in the same direction. The reason I work turn rounds on this is, 1, it keeps this straight. 2, it's what creates this stitch pattern. If all of your stitches are worked in the same direction, you're going to get a different stitch pattern, which isn't a problem, but it's just different. But it will also impact your row gauge when you, and I'm halfway through one of millions of blog posts, but I've been writing a blog post on kind of turning versus not turning, and I've been working the same stitch, and the experiment I did was with half double crochet, but it significantly altered the row gauge whether you turn or don't turn. So that's just something to be aware of for all projects, really. But yeah, so when I'm working turned rounds, in 90% of my patterns, my turning chain never counts as a stitch. I just don't, that's just the way I like to work. So I always ignore the turning chain. When you come to the end of the row, you slip stitch into the top of the first stitch of that row. If you struggle with kind of the start ends and you're losing or gaining stitches, put a stitch marker in the first stitch of the row, so that's where you're going to slip stitch into. Then when you turn, you put one in there as well. when you get to the end of the row, hang on, my brain just needs to do this. So when you turn and work the first stitch of the row, you have to skip the slip stitch. So don't work into the slip stitch that you've just made. That's really easy to do. And then when you get to the end of the row, your last stitch is in the same stitch that you slip stitched into. So you might want to leave that slip stitch in the first stitch until you've done the next row, so you can make sure you're on it. That's just if you have difficulties. Oh, just had something odd happen with my screen. I hope we're still here. Yeah, so I find pulling the slip stitch a little bit tight helps it sort of disappear. And, you know, you can see that line. I'm not going to pretend it's completely invisible. But once I've kind of blocked this, and it does get less visible once I've sewn the end and blocked it. The kind of yarn you're using will make a difference as well. You know, sometimes this is more visible, sometimes less. If you're finding your first stitch is really short, you could even extend so I've used chain 1 as a turning chain. If that's pulling your stitches down or your chains are really tight, you could chain 2 if you wanted to. So, you know, there's a few things you can try if this is bugging you. That is thing 1 I wanted to talk about with this yoke, and this will go, you know, as you go, and this line for the body is going to carry on down the side. So most of the time, you know, I will put this at the back, so it will be the kind of back shoulder, and then it'll mostly be at the underarm, so it's not going to be a distraction. Using variegated yarn is a great way to, well, it can be a great way to hide it. It can also be a great way to highlight it, because if you're coming to the end in one color and then you turn around, you're going to get quite a blunt color change there, which sometimes can look great, sometimes it can look a bit weird. So it totally depends on the type of yarn you're using. The other thing I wanted to talk about with the yarn, with the yokes, and this is something I've done with this one, and it's actually more generally about working in flat circles. So for this side, so this is the Aran weight one, and basically I've got an increase row and a non-increase row, alternating rows in this for the majority of the yoke. What I tend to do with my increases, so I think this one starts with like 4 stitches, increase, 4 stitches, and then the next is 5 stitches, increase, 5 stitches all the way around. So it's that kind of very common way of working a flat circle, because essentially this is more or less flat. Again, like the raglan yoke, if it's not exactly flat, don't worry, it's fine. What I sometimes do to stop getting like really obvious increase lines is I will stagger my increases. So once I get up to say I've got 6 stitches, then an increase, 6 stitches, then an increase. On the next row, I'm going to, so it will be 7 stitches, then an increase. I'm going to maybe make 3 stitches, then an increase, then 7, increase 7, and then I'll work 4 at the end to make up that 7. So what that does is I'll have an increase here, then here, then here, then here. And I kind of wing it, to be honest, where the increases are. I always check my stitch count. But this is how I work pretty much all, whether it's a hat or a sweater or whatever, but things like that I work in the round. I do it with amigurumi as well. I'd like to stagger them, because specifically for this pattern, because you on this yarn weight, you've got, you know, you're alternating increase and non-increase rows. It means that all the increases are made on the same side. So I mean, I didn't do this in all the samples and it's not super obvious, but I think it's definitely less obvious in this one. I think there's a bit here, but I think that's just where it's been folded. And again, once it's blocked, it'll disappear even more. I've also been using the invisible increases that we talked about last week. So when I work my 2 stitches, I work 1 in the back loop and 1 in both loops. And because all my increases are on one side, actually I've kept them in the same. You can see I've also, where I've joined new balls of yarn, I've just can't see, oh yeah, here we go. I've kind of got my ends all on the inside. Yeah, so that's a really useful thing I find for working yoke garments. I'm just having a look at, oh, okay, so any questions? So at the end of the yoke, when you try it on, it should meet your underarm. If it doesn't, should you? That's an excellent question, Sylvia. So let me just read it out loud. So at the end of the yoke, when you try it on, it should meet your underarm. If it doesn't, should you do an extra non-increase row? So I'll come to that. Terry also says, I find that if I put a stitch mark in the very first stitch of the row, not the turning chain, it helps me not add or decrease. Absolutely, Terry. And just ignore the turning chain for this pattern. Just do it to get your height. That's all it's there for. But yeah, stitch marker in the first stitch is, you know, I sometimes lose and gain stitches even after all these years. So sometimes you're just not paying attention and it's like, hang on a second, something's gone off. So yeah, it's a really good habit to get into. So the yoke height. So what you're going to do with the yoke height, so I'm going to pop this back on. This is why I ask you, look, I've got my ends all out now. This is why I talk about blocking and not blocking this swatch. So this doesn't quite, I mean, it sort of reaches, you know, if I pull it, I can get it to reach. Now, obviously, I'm going to put an underarm chain, which is going to bridge that gap. But this is still pretty tight, and I'm not going to want something that tight because it's not going to be very comfortable. But because I made my swatch and then I blocked my swatch, and I know that with blocking, because this is wool, my rows are going to get longer. So I know that this is going to like stretch down. So by the time I've blocked it, I know that's going to be about right. But that's because I looked at my unblock gauge and my block gauge of my swatch. So I have an idea of how much it's going to grow. I've got it all written down somewhere, but you kind of start to develop a bit of a feel for these things. So I'm happy with that. You know, like I say, it doesn't, you know, it's a stretch. I mean, it doesn't help that I've got my arm up, but you know, I can get it to me. And remember the next row, so I've essentially got one more row to add because I'll sort of chain up and then under. So I've got, you know, another row's height to add to this. So it's going to be fine for me. What I would do, if it's obviously too short, then yes, increase, add another non-increase row or two. If you know that your row gauge, and I'm glad you asked this question actually, because I wanted to address this as part of the adjustments. If you know your row gauge is a bit short, so you have more rows in your 10 centimeters than's given in the gauge, you can actually strategically, in a round yoke like this, and actually in the cardigan as well, you can strategically dot extra non-increase rows throughout. So when you're making yokes, the received wisdom is you're better to have more increases like for the first sort of 25 to 50% of the yoke, and then you can have fewer increases as it goes down. So it's because if you think about your shape, you kind of want more increase to get, you know, that steep slant of the shoulder, you know, that's not almost 90 degrees. I mean, it's not realistically, it's there. But then this is a different angle where it goes over your shoulder. So it's better to have more increases up top. And then you have the room for a less steep increase further down the yoke. So yeah, if you know that your row gauge is really short, I would start maybe from about halfway down the row, dotting in the odd extra non-increase row. Something to be aware of with the cardigan, because you've got the V-neck, you're going to want to think about how that might influence the shape of the V-neck. In the version I'm working, you work an increase on the front V on the non-increase rows. So maybe if you're adding non-increase rows, you're not going to want to add those increases. However, if you want more space at the front, for example, on the cardigan, you can add a few more increases at the front side, and that'll give you a bit more bust space on the cardigan. So that's if you want to increase the front bust on the cardi, you know, add them here, and but be consistent with how you add them, so you don't get a kind of wandering neckline. You know, you don't want it to go like that kind of thing. If that makes sense. So yeah, likewise, if you know that your row gauge is too loose, so you have fewer stitches, fewer rows than the given gauge, you might want to drop an increased row out. And again, I would do that towards the end. You kind of, get to the right circumference quicker, and then drop them from the lower end. You don't want to be taking out increased rows, because that's going to impact the number of stitches overall and the number of stitches that you have going around your bicep. So they're kind of the real key adjustments that we're looking at in the yoke section. I will come back to your question about, do you add rows or not? What I would do before checking, there's a couple of things you can do. One, you can block your yoke before you split it, which is something I haven't done with this, and I probably won't, but it's something that you can do. So, because it's quite easy to block a yoke, like, a yoke flat like this. And then you can try it on, and you're working with essentially the kind of finished size items. So you're going to know if it's going to be comfortable or not. So that's one thing you could do. Another thing that I recommend is split your yoke, work the first couple of body rows, and then try it on and just see how it fits. Now, you're going to get not quite accurate on the bust, because you're not going to have the kind of weight to make it sit properly, but you'll get a really good idea of whether it's suitable around your arm side. So yeah, there's a couple of things you could do. I think about your swatch and how much it's stretched with blocking. If you blocked it, if you didn't block it, you can just kind of manually stretch it, or hopefully you've still got it. You can go back, if it's an acrylic one, chuck it in the washing machine, see what that does to it. The other thing to double check is check that your gauge on your actual yoke is still a match. So every now and again, have a look at the gauge that you're working with. This is what I was talking about right at the start, with my gauge swatch being, one thing here and another thing here. The same thing happens when you're working at a larger garment. Your gauge goes off. So just keep an eye that your gauge hasn't wandered too far from what your swatch was and what the pattern calls for, because that's another kind of pitfall that's quite easy to fall down. That was the problem I made with the original green one. My gauge just went off piste, shall we say. So that's really what I wanted to talk about this evening with the yokes. Is anybody who's on the live, does anybody have any questions? Do you want to let me know how you're getting on, how far you've got, any hiccups, any successes you want to share? I know, Terry, you worked it out. There's a few people that got a bit confused and then suddenly it clicked. So well done for persevering there. I'm just going to double check I'm not missing anything on the Facebook page. I should be getting all of the comments in one place, but I just want to check you're all still there okay. If my other screen's working. Okay. Yeah, slight delay, but you're all there. Okay, so I wanted to try and keep it to half an hour this evening, because I know I have a tendency to waffle on. So if there's no other questions, oh, here we go. I'm now rotating on the cardigan, so far gauge and stitch counts are working. Excellent. I love to hear that. I love it when a plan comes together. So satisfying when things are right. I've just blocked a new project, which is part of my summer collection that's coming out in a couple of weeks, and I blocked it and measured it, and I didn't look at the measurements that it should be, and then I checked it, and the neckline was like bang on what it should be, and it was like a very proud moment. It's the little wins that matter. So over the next week, the plan is to get the yokes finished, and then next week we're going to look at splitting the yokes, and we're going to look at body shaping. this is something that comes up quite a lot. So, you know, think about what I've said about the kind of bust shaping, and I will just drop this in now as we're talking about it. So if you want more, somebody asked about whether to, most of the measurements were fine for, I think it was a size large, but they wanted the extra large for the arms. So one thing you can do, and my post, which I'll put on the replays, I'll put a link on the replays, but my post about adjusting top-down sweaters goes into quite a lot of detail. But when you've actually got something to work with, it's easier to demonstrate. So what you can do with a round yoke like this, it's a bit harder with the raglan. You can redistribute where you split the yoke. So say if you've got a bit of extra space at the back, you can actually take a few stitches and make a larger front section and then keep the arms the same. So you can just redistribute where the split is, and maybe, you know, if you want a few extra stitches for the bust, you can add in a few extra increases, you know, on one of the non-increase rows or wherever you need it. And then just when you split the yoke, just have those stitches at the front. The way the pattern works is it splits the front and back evenly, but that's easy. It's there to be adjusted. It's there to fit your shape. Sometimes I've got quite a dippy back, so sometimes I end up with quite a bit of extra space at this kind of lower back bit. And we're going to talk next week about a few ways to kind of, you know, pinch it in at the back, or, you know, allow a bit of extra room in the front, or maybe, you know, a bit of waist shaping and maybe even some hip shaping. So we're going to talk about different ways to do that next week. So that's just a little bit of advanced warning for you. But if you've got any questions on that, make sure you ask them, because this is one of the things I get asked about a lot. Renee, I'm adding on more non-increase at the bottom for a loose fit for the sweater. Yeah, it's a great way to customize it for, you know, some people really like some tops I really like with a nice, really sort of just a lot of space on the armholes. Nothing worse than something that's like up there and it's not comfortable. So yeah, it's good to see. The other thing I would say about adding rows, if you add a lot of rows, remember that your sleeve, you're not going to change the sleeve stitches as such, but as you increase the length of the row, it means the sleeve is going to kind of start a bit further down your arm. So if I have a yoke that comes to here and I add on a few increases so it comes to here, it's kind of, instead of going like that, it's going to go like that. I mean, that's extreme. So just bear that in mind when it comes to the sleeves. You might want to knock those extra rows off the sleeve length. I mean, the sleeves are great because you can just work them until they're the right length. Using 100% cotton, so not so much stretch. Yeah, cotton's a really interesting one for garments because it doesn't have that. So you're still going to get some stretch between the stitches, but the fibre itself is not going to stretch. And cotton's, yeah, it's always really interesting working with cotton in a garment and just accommodating that. Oh, I've got someone else on row 18. And your gauge didn't change when you washed it. That's great. So you know what you're working with. You can see how useful it is to actually, I like advocate so much about gauges, and the more garments I do, the more I'm like, you need to block and wash it, because, or even just stretch it and like torment it a little bit, just so you know what's going to happen. You know, when you're pulling a sweater on and off over your head, you're going to be stretching it and moving it. So you kind of need to know what's going to happen with that. It's getting a little bit dark. I'm going to say goodbye in a minute, but I might just pop the light on so it's a bit better. Yes, I'm not in the dark. Yeah, so I think if there's no more questions, we'll call that, still 40 minutes, we'll call that a night. And good luck with the rest of your yokes. Next week, my plan for next week, I'm going to split this so I can demonstrate some of the shaping, and I should have finished the raglan, and then I'll do a little demo on how to split the yoke with this raglan one next week. Susan, I crochet for grandkids who throw garments in the wash. Yeah, Your swatch shrank from bulky to Aaron once the swatch dried. That's interesting. Should I go with bulky gauge, hoping it will shrink? I'm going to read this again, Susan. So I quoted, my swatch shrank from bulky to Aaron once washed and dried. That's interesting. What fibre are you using, Susan? Should I go with bulky gauge, hoping it will shrink to next smaller size? Are you wanting to change the size that you're making, or are you wanting to change the gauge that you're working with? That's really interesting because most often I find mine stretches, but it depends entirely on the fibre you're using and how it's being washed. And especially I don't have a tumble dryer, so I never dry stuff, but I know sometimes drying stuff can shrink it. If you're using a wool and it's shrinking, you want to be a bit careful with washing because you don't want it to felt. And what I would do, Susan, I would check how the swatch moves and you're still happy with the drape on it after it's shrunk. And if it has shrunk, then I'd go with the sort of finished gauge, because generally once it's worn, unless it's wool, it's acrylic. So acrylic, generally you're not going to get that felting, and acrylic will, in my experience, stretch with wear. So I always say, don't hold me to this because there's always exceptions, but I always say it's better to have it a little bit tight and stretch out, because once it's finished, unless you're shrinking in the wash, it's never going to get smaller. It's only going to get bigger with wear and movement and tugging. So I would go with the Aaron gauge. If that's what your washed swatch is telling you, then go with that. You might want to just kind of keep an eye. And actually, Aaron and bulky are interesting because I can't remember what the difference in gauge is. I've got the so that's interesting. There's quite a difference in, so your Aaron gauge is 12 stitches and 11 rows, and your chunky or your bulky is 9.5 versus 9. So if you end up somewhere in the middle, if you're using chunky yarn, because the other thing to consider with this is if you're using a bulky weight yarn and you're working with the Aaron gauge, you're going to use quite a lot more yarn. So I might be tempted, depending on how close you are to one or the other, to look at maybe working with a bigger hook and sticking with the bulky gauge. It's a difficult one when you're in between, and there's a few things to consider. I would probably be tempted to go up a hook side and stick with the bulky, because you're gonna use less yarn that way. That might just be me that thinks about these things, but it's kind of, you get less meterage or yardage of yarn in your ball for a bulky weight than you do for a worsted weight. You did like the drape better, thanks. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, I think it sounds like you've got a gut feeling for what you want to do, Susan, so kind of go with that. I think now all the things to kind of consider, and you've got to make a call. It's like when I was doing this and I was like, do I risk going down to a 3.5 mil hook, because this is for the double knit, and originally it was a 4.5 mil, but because of my experience with this yarn, I'm like, I'm just going to go down to the 3.5, and we'll see next week how the yoke is looking. So I'm going down the 3.5 and just keeping it relaxed. So we shall see. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Otter and Papoose. I'm glad you managed to join us. Thank you, everybody else who I hope is with us. And I think I'll go for the same time next week. I need to double check my diary that Sunday is still good, but I hope Sunday, for those of you in the US, certainly gives you the rest of the day to sit and crochet. So thank you very much, and again, as always, drop any questions in the blog post, Insta, email me, wherever, and I will make sure I cover them next week. Okay, have a fabulous rest of week. In the UK, we've got a bank holiday tomorrow, so it's going to be a quiet one here, which I'm very much looking forward to. So have a great time. I'll see you next week. Bye.